Undo, 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 undo. What I want to do in this presentation, as the title indicates, the future past, the unfurling of great compassion, is to just, because of all of the deep connections between ABSC and my father, to share some memories of my father. But when we share memories of somebody who's near and dear to us, it can fall into just reminiscences. But it's not. But I think this, as we've already seen by some of the comments that you've shared in your self-intros, the significance of remembering someone is not just to reminisce, but to realize that they continue to be with us, and especially through the Dharma, and that it provides us with touchstones for moving into the future as we find our way along the stepping stones of life and the stepping stone of the Namu path. The Dharma unfolds. This peony reminds me, the Dharma is very, very beautiful. It's very, very rich. There are many, many layers, like the many layers of the flower petals of the peony blossom. It's also something that unfolds. It's not something that goes in a straight line. It's not something where we can easily chart our course from A to B to C. It's something that needs to be nurtured, that comes into being in its own time. The journey that my father shared with many of you, and certainly the one that he shared with me, was that kind of unfolding journey where there were many twists and turns in the journey of life together between father and son and with many of you. And in that process, I think there was a great unfolding, there was a great flowering of the Dharma. It's a photo taken when he was professor at Smith College, as many of you know. So here are some of the themes that I just want to share with you today. Of course, we can always be reminded of the basic teachings of Shin Buddhism, at the heart of which is the dynamic interplay between the two aspects of existence, between blind passion and boundless compassion, and the rhythm of that unfolding, which is the continuing journey of our lives and of our deaths, and the continuing journey of the Nembutsu path. That we get caught up in our attachments, we get caught up in our blind passions, our passions which are desires and emotions, which in and of themselves is a natural part of life. They only become a problem because we become attached to how we want our desires to turn out, how we want our feelings to be recognized, how we want things to go in life. And so we're blinded in the direction and the course of our passions, and we get stuck. But reality, taking the form of the deep flow of the oneness of reality, of the great vastness of emptiness, of boundless compassion, inevitably releases us, makes us face our own blindness, makes us face our attachments, and leads us into the unfolding of boundless compassion, which gently illuminates and envelops and dissolves the hard edges of our attachments and blind passion. And in personified form, we call this the interplay of ourselves as foolish beings filled with blind passions and the healing, releasing action of reality itself in the form of boundless compassion, or Amida Buddha. And this is realized in concrete form in our chanting practice through the six-syllable name Namu Amida Butsu, which means I, this foolish being filled with blind passions, entrust myself to the unfolding of infinite light and boundless compassion. And of course, physically at one level, it is we who do the chanting. But ultimately, we are responding to the call of reality itself, arising from deep within that embraces us and releases us from the bonds of our attachments and sufferings. So this is the context in which I'd like to share some recollections of my father, Taitetsu Unno, which will bring us to the realization of suffering as connection and compassion, and a deep appreciation for everything that happens to us and everything that we receive in life. So there's a photo of my father. This must be from about, probably, I'm going to say it's probably around 12 years ago at the American Buddha Study Center with Hoshina and Josephine and others as he spoke there, bringing back many memories. And some of the recollections that I'd like to share with you. So the first recollection is a recollection of what I call the pet dog. So when I was 2 years old, my father took our family to Japan. He was finishing his studies in Tokyo. And when I was about 5 years old, I noticed that a number of my friends had pet dogs. So one day at home, I said to my parents in Japanese, I said, "Can I have a pet dog?" And there was a moment of silence, and my father finally said, he said, "Well, we're going back to America, Mark. So it's not really practical for us to get a dog now. So can you wait until we go back to America? And it's not going to be too long." So being a small boy, I was disappointed, but I understood and I accepted that. And so, I let it pass, basically. But then a couple months later, my father said, "Marky, would you like to go get a pet?" And I thought, we get to have a pet dog? So I got all excited. And we lived in a small house, which was a rental house in Tokyo. And it was a few blocks from the shopping district called Shotengai. So we walked to the shopping district, which is only about 3 or 4 blocks of these tiny little family stores, grocers, ramen shops, and so on and so forth. And we're walking down, and I thought, I don't remember there being a pet shop on the street. And then we start to turn into this Shinto shrine. And then I thought to myself, I don't remember there being a pet shop in the Shinto shrine. So we went into the Shinto shrine, and we're going towards the back, and there's no pet shop there, but there's a bunch of small bamboo cages and an open air kiosk. And my father approaches the man who's running the kiosk and says, "Can we have one of these?" And the guy says, "Yeah, of course." And then so he takes a bamboo cage and then he presents it to me. And he says, "See, Mark?" And I looked inside, and it was a grasshopper. And it just wasn't quite the fluffy, cute dog that I had imagined. Anyways, we went home, and then my father hung the little cage from the ceiling. And then he opened a little bamboo cage door, and he started to feed this grasshopper pieces of cucumber and later pieces of watermelon. And then after a while he said, "Mark, would you like to try?" And I was really not interested. I was playing with my toys and just wasn't the pet dog I imagined. So I just kind of said, no, I'm not interested. But every day my father would feed the grasshopper. And eventually my curiosity was piqued, so I would be peeking over and looking and looking and looking. Finally, my father turned and he said, "Mark, do you want to try?" And immediately I said, "Yeah, I want to try." So he had me hold the cucumber stick, and he opened the door, and I put it in. And to my delight, the grasshopper started munching away on the cucumber, and I was hooked. So we kept feeding this cucumber, and then eventually my father would take the cucumber out of the cage on his hand and was feeding the cucumber. And then eventually, my mother was learning the flower arrangement, traditional Japanese flower arrangement at the time. So my father put the grasshopper on the flower arrangement, and the grasshopper would start eating the flower on the flower arrangement. Well, one day, when we were getting ready to go out for dinner, my father decided to leave the grasshopper on the flower arrangement. This was an old rickety house with sliding doors. So even when you closed the door, it didn't close all the way. So if the grasshopper had wanted to escape, it could have easily done so. But when we came home that night, it was still there sitting on the flower arrangement. And thereafter, my father would often leave the grasshopper on the flower arrangement. And it never tried to escape. When we came home, it was always there. And eventually I felt this grasshopper was my little friend, especially since I didn't have any brothers or sisters. So any little creature became part of our family until it passed away about a year ago. So that was one of the first experiences that I had of this deep intimacy with nature and with all of creation, which is really at the heart of Buddhism. And wouldn't it be a wonderful life if we could feel such closeness and affection for everyone and everything and all creatures at all times? But that's not the way life goes, is it? When a mosquito would come and bite me, I would kill the mosquito. Or if an ant got onto my piece of toast and onto the jam, I didn't feel the same way. So that's when the problems began. If we could all just be harmonious all the time and be one with everything and everyone, then there's no need for Buddhism. We only need the Buddhist path because we run into troubles. We start having likes and dislikes and attachments, and we get stuck. So that brings me to the second story. The second story is the elbow does not bend outward. So a story that many of you have heard. So I still have the letter that my father wrote to D.T. Suzuki, who is well known for introducing Zen Buddhism to the West, but also did a great deal to introduce Shin Buddhism to the West as well. And one day my father asked D.T. Suzuki, what is karma? And I'm not going to give the longer version of the story, but my father had just recently lost one of his best friends who had committed suicide at the very end of his career at the University of Tokyo. And my father wanted to know why his brilliant young friend had left this world while he was still here. What is karma? Why do we have all of this suffering? And D.T. Suzuki's answer was, the elbow does not bend outward. The elbow does not bend outward. So this story struck me a great deal. What is the meaning of this? What is the meaning of this? Why couldn't my father's brilliant friend go on and have the great career and life that he deserved instead of leaving his family? And my father went to visit the mother, and she was heartbroken. And my father really couldn't say or do anything to help her. So the elbow does not bend outward means we can't force things to be the way we want them to be. Why can't we have things that only seem like they would be the right things to happen? Why do some of the best people get sick and die? Why do people who do cruel and destructive things often get to live to a long old age and may not even be caught or be punished? It seems so unfair. The elbow does not bend outward. means we can't force the world to be the way that we want it to be, no matter how fair or unfair it seems to be. So another way to understand this is receptivity. Our culture, American culture, is a very proactive culture. It's a can-do culture. What we're seeing from this great tragedy of the novel coronavirus and COVID-19, that we just can't seem to force our way forward in society. Even if we're wearing masks, we can't seem to force other people to follow the right practices. And what that means is that while we should do the things that we can do, and we should do the things that are in our control, there's a great deal of life that is outside of our control. And that's when we have to learn that elbow does not bend outward. That's when we have to learn the opposite of being proactive, which is not being passive, but it's actually being receptive. And what receptive means is no matter how I want things to turn out, and no matter how things refuse to go according to the way that I want them to, I have to receive the circumstances of life. But receiving is not just accepting. It means receiving and then seeing what I can do with what I've received. So to give a very small example, when I was a small child, I wanted to be an NBA basketball player, but those dreams evaporated with the end of my growth spurt at 5 feet, 5.5 inches. I'll take every half inch. But I didn't just give up and say, oh, well, life sucks. I thought, what else can I do that's similar to being an NBA basketball star? Well, one of the things that attracted me about these athletes was they got the summers off. I thought, what else can I do where I get the summers off? And I looked at my father and I thought, he doesn't work in the summer and he's a professor. Maybe I could do that too. So that's a way that we can receive the things that we can't change, but find new possibilities that fulfill us. So what's important about that is that when we learn to be receptive, rather than blindly trying to force things, then we are able to see deeper possibilities that life holds than when we were trying to force everything into the lens of our predetermined view of life. Not only that, but when we encounter difficulty and we're able to share in the travails and difficulties that others have, then we can come to appreciate deeper connections that arise as a result of our acknowledging that there is both joy and suffering, the tears of pain, but also the tears of laughter. So this is related to the next point, waiting until 30. So when I graduated from college, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And so I went home and I knew that eventually I wanted to go to Japan. So in order to do that, I had to take additional classes. I had been studying Japanese, but I need to study more Japanese. Not just modern Japanese, but classical Japanese. And not just Japanese, but if I want to study Buddhism, I also needed to study Chinese. So I took additional classes after going home at the University of Massachusetts. I also worked part-time at a local stereo store. But I still wasn't sure. Was I going to study Buddhism? What did I want to do with my life? And one day my father said, Mark, you might be interested in this article that I have to, that I read, that I want to share with you. It was like Newsweek. So he had the page earmarked. So I picked up the article. I started to read it. And this article was about a father talking to his son. And the only line I remember from this article, there's only one sentence I remember from this article, which is, "Son, I don't want you to know what you're going to do with the rest of your life until you're 30 years old." This is not what most parents think. Most parents are nervous, wanting their children to go to school or perhaps graduate from college, get a job right away, get settled, meet someone nice, get married and have a family. But no, this father turned to his son, who was still in his early 20s, and said, "Son, I don't want you to know what you're going to do with the rest of your life until you're 30 years old." And when I read that, I breathed a big sigh of relief. I thought, I don't have to know yet. Well, where did this come from? Well, looking back many years later, I realized it came from my father's own experience. So everybody knows my father as the Reverend Dr. Taitetsu Unno, who was a pioneer in the field of Buddhist studies in the academic world. He was one of the first native English-speaking ministers in the Buddhist churches of America. He was well known in those two worlds. But it wasn't a straight path for my father at all. He didn't study Buddhism in college. There wasn't Buddhism in college back in 1950. He majored in English literature. So even into his 80s, he could recite Chaucer in Middle English. He majored in English literature. Then he was able to go to study in Japan. But after he finished his master's degree, he came back. And he tried to get into a PhD program in philosophy. But there was no philosophy program in the US where he could study Buddhism and comparative philosophy. So then he went back to Japan again. And that's when he took my mother and myself to finish his degree in Japan. And then he came back to this country and he had to find a job. His first job was at University of Illinois. It was a one-year replacement position. He had some connection there, and they said, well, we have a need for someone to teach East Asian history for 1 year. Well, my father's area is Buddhism, not East Asian history. He said, is it okay if I teach about ancient Chinese history? They said yes, because he had, as part of his study of Buddhism, he studied the background of Confucian philosophy, of Taoist philosophy. So it was close enough. That's how he began his career. So it was not a straight path at all. In that sense, the elbow does not bend outward. It didn't go smoothly. He couldn't force the University of California, Berkeley philosophy department to accept Buddhist philosophy. He couldn't force it. So he went back to Japan. Right? He couldn't force the University of Illinois to say, you don't have a position in Buddhism, make one. No, he had to shoehorn his teaching into the history department in early Chinese history. The elbow does not bend outward. But from all these experiences, when he looked at his own son, not sure whether he should go left, not sure whether he should go right, he didn't say, hey, Mark, hurry up and get a job. No, instead, he gave me an article that said, I don't want you to know what you're going to do with the rest of your life until you're 30. So in the earlier story, I shared that when we are able to be illuminated on how stuck we are on some unrealistic expectation, then we could go deeper and find another possibility, becoming a professor instead of a basketball player. But the real fruit of an elbow does not bend outward is more than that. It's that by bumping up against the walls of life that will not yield, we get scrapes and bruises. We experience suffering. But it's that suffering that enables us to connect with others at that deepest level and gives rise to the wisdom, waiting until 30. And the last story I want to share here, smiling at the moon. So after teaching at University of Illinois for 3 years, my parents moved to Massachusetts, where my father taught at Smith College for 35 years. That's a long time. I just finished my 20th year here at the University of Oregon. And I can already see the light at the end of the tunnel. All right. So my father was at Smith College for 35 years. After he retired in 1998, they lived there another 9 years. During that time, they had the Northampton Shin Buddhist Sangha. Small Sangha, but it was a vibrant Sangha. They traveled, but eventually they start to slow down physically. Their friends start to pass away or move to be away with their children. So I said, Mom and Dad, do you want to move out here to Oregon? And in fact, my wife, Megumi, she designed the house. She's not an architect. She's not trained, but she's good at design. She designed the house for them. I was the general contractor. We designed a house for them. When they came out to see it in 2007, immediately my mother said, can we live here? And 2 months later, we had moved everything into that house, and they were living in that house, and they had sold their house in Northampton. Long story short. So it was a very, very big decision for my parents to leave their home of 35 years, where they had many connections, and come out here to Oregon to be with us. But of course, it was a decision made in a matter of a couple months, so there were prior commitments. My father had made a commitment, and I had made a commitment to go speak at Palo Alto Buddhist Temple, where Reverend Will Masuda was the minister. So we drove down. We decided to drive down together as a family. It was 9.5 hours, so it was a very long drive in summer. And we had a nice event. And then we were driving back, and we needed to take a bathroom break. So we stopped at a gas station near Mount Shasta in California. It was a very beautiful summer day. And my father was standing outside, and I was standing outside. And it was about, I think it was probably about 6:30. And I looked up into the sky, and it was still a bright sky, but I could see the moon faintly in the sky. And I said, look, Dad, there's the moon. And he looked up, and he had this big smile on his face. And I didn't have a camera with me at that moment, but I took out the camera of my heart. And I took a photo of my father's great smile in that moment. And I put it back in my heart. And that photo that I took with my mind and with my heart is still with me today. And that moment represents for me a lot of different things, but it represents a journey that we took together. The journey that the son took with his father, but the journey that the father was willing to take with his son, to leave his home of 35 years in Massachusetts and to complete his life journey together with his son, Mark. Several years ago, I went back to Massachusetts. I've been going back. This is the first year I'm not going back in 14 years. Because my father and I were leading a retreat together at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies. And then after he could no longer travel, then I led the event. When I was back there, I met one of the Northampton Sangha members for lunch. Her name is Bernadette. And she shared with me, she said, Mark, At one of our last Sangha meetings, your father shared with us that, he was planning to move to Oregon to be with you. And we had set up a planning process. So they knew a couple of years in advance. And we set up a process for them. But one day he came in and he sat down. And he had Reverend Seki's book, Hoshina's father's book, The Great Natural Way, in his hand. And he said, he slammed the book down on the podium. And he said, there comes a time you realize you have to do what's most natural. And he became very emotional. And I had never heard that story before. And what that story was about was that my father felt from deep within the necessity not to move to Oregon just because he was becoming more physically frail. Not to move to Oregon just because his social circle was becoming smaller. But that he had to complete his journey with his son Mark, even though he was going to be leaving many things behind. And when Bernadette told me that story, I was deeply moved to realize that. So this brings me to this last moment. Thank you for everything and everything. So I'm just going to keep it brief because we're at the end of the hour. But as some of you know, my father, we were very fortunate because my father passed away at home. He was at ease. He was not in pain. We were all together. So these are things that we cannot control in life. And we know that many, tens of thousands of people are having to say goodbye to family members, not being able to be with them, their family members dying alone. And at best, they're able to connect through, the internet one last time because they're having to be isolated because of COVID-19. So these are circumstances we cannot control. But in this case, we're fortunate we're all able to be together. And one of the things that my father and I shared with one another is I said to him, in Japanese, I said, "Nani mo kamo arigato." And he said, "Sore wa kochi yo." There's no exact translation for this Japanese. Nani mo kamo arigato. The best translation I could come up with is thank you for everything and everything. Thank you for everything and everything. That means thank you for the happy times and thank you for the sad times. Thank you for all the joy, but also thank you for the difficult moments we went through. This is the ultimate expression of receptivity. Buddhism begins at the point where we cannot force life to go according to our wishes, when life is out of our control. And yet, we have to find a way to receive the unfolding of life and death beyond our control. And when we are able to deeply, deeply receive life and death, then we realize the deepest connection, the deepest significance of life, which is suffering as connection, transformed into the realization of great compassion. That's the meaning of Namu Amida Butsu. And that's the meaning of thank you for everything and everything. So many of us are experiencing frustration of being isolated, but also difficulties, financial uncertainty, work uncertainty, not being able to be with friends and family members, but the great compassion of life itself, the deep flow of the oneness of reality, receives us into her bosom without any hesitation. So that when the great flowering of life itself receives us into her heart, then it enables us to open our hearts so that we too become receptacles of everything that existence has in wait for us, so that we too are moved to say thank you for everything and everything. And that is the Alpha and Omega of the 6-syllable name, Namu Amida Butsu. Thank you very much. I just want to briefly conclude with just chanting the numbers. Unno, 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 Unno.